Hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 27, Section 2, Case Study Nigeria. So let's review just a little bit. The Europeans have come into the continent of Africa. They have cut it into pieces, and they have done this for their own purposes. They have held the Berlin Conference, which was in 1884 and 1885, with the goal of trying to divide up Africa amongst themselves and keep themselves from war. And there has been a war. Even though black South Africans fought in the war, the Boer War was mainly a European war that was fought on African soil over the territory in South Africa. So there's been a lot of conflict, a lot of divisions, and a lot of death going on in Africa over this issue of imperialism. So let's get started. We're going to be discussing some specifics of what day-to-day life looked like, and specifically looking at Nigeria as an example of some of the events that happened during this imperial era. So, in the 18th and 19th centuries, these imperialistic European countries wished to have total control over the lands of the people that they conquered. They were determined to shape the economies of the lands to benefit European countries, and they went so far as to desire the people to adopt European customs and lifestyles even. And each European nation had certain policies and goals for establishing colonies. They also used different methods and techniques for establishing that control. Over time, we eventually saw four general forms of control. Okay? We describe these as colony, protectorate, sphere of influence, and economic imperialism. So let's take a look at each type in detail. So a colony is a country or territory that is governed internally by a foreign power. So the people actually go there and they rule there and begin to spread. An example of this would be Somaliland in East Africa, which was a French colony. So the French came and they lived there and they ruled there. The next form is a protectorate, and this is where a country or territory has its own internal government, but that government is under the control of an imperial power or an outside power. An example of this would be that Britain established a protectorate over the Niger River Delta, and this eventually grew into the country Nigeria, which we're going to talk about specifically in a little bit. The third kind is a sphere of influence, and this is an area in which an outside power claims exclusive investment or trading privileges over that area. An example of this would be Liberia, which was under the sphere of influence of the United States, which means basically, they were only allowed to do business with the United States, no one else. The next version is economic imperialism, and this is an independent but less developed country being controlled by private business interests rather than other governments. So an example of this would be how the Dole Fruit Company controlled the pineapple trade in Hawaii and therefore controlled much of the things that were going on in Hawaii because they were so dependent on their pineapple trade. So in addition to these types of control, these countries also differed in their methods of managing their colonies. There were two basic methods that emerged, indirect and direct. Britain and other nations such as the United States preferred indirect control, whereas France and most other European nations preferred a more direct approach. And we can see that once these colonies became independent, the type of management that was over them had a strong influence on the type of government that was established once the Europeans left. So first, let's talk about the indirect method. The indirect method relied on local leaders, and in some areas, the British would ask a local ruler to accept British authority to rule. Then these local officials handled much of the daily management of the colony. Many of these colonies also included a legislative council that included colonial officials, as well as local merchants and professionals that were all nominated by the colonial governor. The goal was that the council would train local leaders in the British method of government, and then eventually the population would govern itself. Now let's talk about the direct method. The direct method was used by nations such as France and some of the other European powers. They did not believe that Africans were even capable to handle the complexities of running a country. So this is pure racism at its finest. And based on this terrible attitude, they developed a policy called paternalism. And using this policy, the Europeans would govern people in a parental way by providing the things they needed, like a parent would to a child, but not really giving them a say in anything, so not really giving them any rights. They accomplished this by bringing in their own bureaucrats and their own officials to rule, and didn't train people in the European method of governing, but just imposed it upon them. They also employed a policy of assimilation. This policy was based on the idea that in time, all of these people that they were ruling over should be like the French, because obviously, in the French mind, their way is the best, and why wouldn't the Africans want to be like them? So instead of letting them choose that, they said, well, they're going to choose us anyways eventually because we're better. Let's go ahead and just make them do it. So they enforced a policy that all schools, courts, and businesses should be patterned after French ones. Eventually, this didn't work because, as we know, the Africans were smart, they were capable, and nobody as an adult likes to be treated by another country as a child. So this didn't really work. And eventually, the French abandoned these methods and settled for a policy of association. This was similar to an indirect control, and they eventually came to recognize that African institutions could work, but they still thought that they were inferior to the French method. So let's move on and talk a little bit about Nigeria. So Nigeria is a classic example of the story of an African colony. Britain originally gained control of southern Nigeria through diplomatic and military means. So they set up, partnerships with some of the local tribes. They signed treaties with them and got some of them to agree to British rule. But not everybody did. Those who opposed the intervention and rebelled against it were then put down militarily. Northern Nigeria was conquered by the Royal Niger Company in the name of the British. And this company gained control of the palm oil trade all along the Niger River. And all of those benefits would be filtered back to the British. So when the Berlin Conference rolled around, the British were the primary force in the area, so they were given a protectorate over the Niger River Delta. And then in 1914, the British claimed the entire area of Nigeria as a colony. So it started out as a protectorate, and the control grew until it became a colony. So now that they had claimed the land and created a colony, it was not just enough to say, hey, this is mine. They now had to control it and govern it, which did not turn out to be very easy. Nigeria was one of the most culturally diverse areas in Africa, and this led to a lot of conflicts. There were about 250 different ethnic groups that lived in this area. There were three main ones, and I'm probably going to butcher saying these, but the three main ones were the Hausa Fulani, the Yoruba, and the Igbo. And these groups all had different languages, different cultures, different religions. And so there was a lot of conflict being had when they were forced together into one large group. And the British simply just did not have enough troops to govern over such a large and complex area. So they eventually employed the indirect method of ruling this land by creating leaders among the different groups themselves. And this management method worked well for some of the groups, but not others. It was also not uncommon for the African people to resist the efforts of the Europeans to rule over them, though we find that none of these really were successful, with the exception of one, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And it eventually became next to impossible to succeed because the Europeans just had better weapons. Remember, we talked about in section 1, they had those Maxim machine guns, and the Africans, there was only so much they could do when they were up against machine guns with their swords and other weapons, and their single guns. And so let's talk about a couple specific unsuccessful movements. Over a period of about 50 years, Algeria was fighting against their French rulers. And their movement was led by a gentleman who I, again, am probably going to butcher his name, Samoei Toure, in West Africa. And he was able to have a little bit more success because he modernized his army and was able to stand up to the French off and on for a period of 16 years. But eventually he was unsuccessful and the French gained complete control over Algeria. And then the second case that we're going to talk about is the Maji Maji Rebellion. And this one is actually pretty sad. In German East Africa, not that Algeria wasn't sad too, I guess, but this one, it gets you a little bit. In German East Africa, villagers put their faith in a spiritual defense. they disliked that the Europeans were forcing them to grow things like cotton instead of food because you can't eat cotton. And for some reason, amongst them, they started to believe that if they used a magic water, that when they went up against the Germans, if they sprinkled this water on their bodies, that the Germans' bullets would turn into water when they hit their bodies. And they called that water Magi Magi. I may not be pronouncing that right, but basically they thought that they were untouchable. They also thought that their ancestors, when they went to war, were going to rise up from the grave and fight alongside them. So with these two beliefs, they attacked a German machine gun post and were mowed down by the thousands. And officially, which again, the records were not always the best in this period, but officially over 75,000 men died that day. And this even saddened the Germans a little bit because they realized that this was just so tragic. And so they were very shaken by the resistance, and it actually had at least a little bit of a positive outcome in that the Germans made a concerted effort to make the colonialism more acceptable to the Africans so that something like this wouldn't happen again. But again, it's very sad because they really truly thought that they were going to be able to survive this. Now let's talk about one country that broke this rule, okay? They were successful in fighting off the Europeans, and that country is Ethiopia. This victory was due specifically to one man, their king, Menelik II. In 1889, he became emperor of Ethiopia, and he felt the Europeans closing in on him on all sides. Everybody wanted to gain a piece of his land. And in order to maintain his independence, he started playing them against one another. He would go back and forth between them and pretend to be cooperating, but then at the last minute say, I think I'm going to go with this country instead of yours. And so this allowed him to maintain some independence for a while. While he was playing these games, he was also buying up some of the technology that he knew he was going to need in order to be able to stand up against the Europeans. So he's buying modern weapons, such as the machine guns, from France and Russia. So he eventually did come to the point where he signed a treaty, but he thought that he was giving up just a very small amount of his land. And once the treaty was translated into his native language, he realized that what the Italians had done was claimed all of Ethiopia as a protectorate, and Menelik was not happy about this. So as the Italians began advancing into northern Ethiopia to claim their territory, Menelik declared war. And in one of the greatest battles in the history of Africa, the Battle of Adawa, Ethiopian forces defeated the Italians and they kept their nation independent. After this battle, Menelik didn't just sit back and rest. He continued to purchase weapons and keep his army and his arsenal full in case another European power decided they wanted to try to have a go at him. And because of that, he was able to keep Ethiopia independent. So now let's talk about Europeans' involvement in Africa as a whole. Now, if we're looking at this through the scope of history, we can see that there were positives and there were negatives. However, the negatives for sure outweighed the positives, but let's talk about them. So, Africa, some of the negatives. Africa lost control over much of their land and their independence. They were introduced to new diseases that killed many people. The most troubling of these was smallpox. They also lost thousands and thousands of their people to fighting against the Europeans, trying to get them to leave. So they had huge amounts of loss of life. Also through the cruelty of people like Leopold II, many Africans were killed. Famines also resulted as they were forced to grow cash crops like cotton or tobacco instead of the food that they used to grow for their families. In this period of time, most people that were farmers would only grow enough food for their family. But if they're being forced to grow cotton, you can't eat cotton, and they weren't selling it to each other, so a lot of people went hungry in this period. There also was a breakdown of culture in this period. The Europeans didn't care about what was traditional and what was important to these cultures, and so they forced them to do things that were not in line with their culture and tradition. And a lot of the people that grew up around the Europeans began to desire their life, their luxuries, their things, and they began to admire them and want to be like them instead of valuing their own culture. So there was a lot of loss of culture, breakdown of culture. Traditional leaders were toppled over, and a lot of things. This caused a lot of identity crises for many of these Africans. But the very most harmful effect of all of these was the division of the African continent. This caused long-held conflicting or warring tribes to be lumped together, and all of a sudden they were expected to behave as if they were one country. They also would break apart tribes that traditionally had alliances into separate countries and not be expected to trade with each other anymore. And these boundaries were forced down by the Europeans, and it unnaturally combined groups and unnaturally divided groups that had long been working together or fighting against each other. And these issues of these boundaries would plague Africa for many, many years down the line. However, as we looking back from today, we can see that there were some positives. One of the things is it reduced local warfare. The Africans were too busy fighting the Europeans to fight each other anymore. And the Europeans also would enforce and keep them from fighting one another because they wanted them to work and create things and harvest coal and cotton and tobacco. And so they weren't necessarily having the same conflicts that they had before. Also, there were a lot of people that came in and wanted to do humanitarian efforts. And so this improved sanitation. This allowed the establishment of hospitals and schools. This led to higher literacy rates among the children because they were being taught to read by these humanitarians and missionaries. And there was also a lot of economic expansion. The African products began to be valued on the international market. Before, they just were selling to one another and trading to one another, but now they're able to sell their products to people in other countries. We hear Madagascar vanilla when we go to Starbucks sometimes. Well, Madagascar did not have the opportunity to trade with the world until really this period. And let me touch back. They also had a lot longer lifespans due to the improved sanitation and the better health care they were getting. They also had more railroads, dams, telephone lines, telegraph lines, because the Europeans wanted to communicate with one another. So they put these things in place. However, for a very long time, all of these things only really helped the European cause and not the African cause. So that's all for section 2. Next section, we're going to be discussing some of the actions that Europeans took in different areas of the world because Africa apparently was not enough. They needed more land, so they started looking to other places, specifically the areas that were dominated by the Muslims. So we're going to look at some of the events that happened there in section 3. Thanks for listening.